Most people assume that history moves forward and that societies, even through periods of disorder, gradually becomes more stable and capable over time. However, the actual record of history makes this assumption hard to defend. What history shows far more consistently is a pattern of cycles, periods of strong institutions and public trust, followed by periods of cultural questioning, slow decay, and crisis. The cycle never repeats exactly, but its shape appears across enough different civilizations to be taken seriously as a way of understanding the present. The cycle can be broken down into four phases. The first is a period of high trust, in which the existing order is widely accepted as legitimate, social cohesion is strong, and the culture expects individuals to contribute to something larger than themselves. This phase usually follows a major crisis, and its ability is largely sustained by the fact that people who lived through the crisis are still around and are still able to explain what it cost and why it cannot be allowed to happen again. The second phase is one of questioning, in which the established order starts to feel like a constraint rather than a protection. Authority is challenged, individualism rises, and the generation that grew up benefiting from the stability of the first phase begins to take it for granted. The third phase is an unraveling. Trust in institutions declines. The shared values that held the culture together starts to break apart, and competing factions increasingly develop different accounts of what the country is and what it owes its citizens. The fourth phase is crisis, the point at which the accumulated pressures of the previous phases can no longer be managed within the existing system, and the order either renews itself or fractures. What makes this framework useful is not just its description of events, but its accounts of the kind of people each phase tends to produce. Stable periods reward managers, people skilled at maintaining and refining systems that already work. Crisis periods rewards a different type, more decisive, more willing to act outside established norms, and less interested in process than in outcomes. This shift is not merely political, it changes what the culture values, what kind of speeches resonate, and what qualities people look for in a leader. A figure who would have seemed reckless or extreme during a period of institutional confidence can seem in a period of advanced decay not just acceptable but obviously necessary. This isn't because the public has lost its mind, but because the conditions that made caution and moderation functional have changed. The United States today have shown signs of the third and fourth phases at the same time. Trust in nearly every major institution, whether government, media, medicine, the courts, finance, or the universities, has collapsed. The cultural consensus that held the post-war order together has broken into factions that disagree not just on policy, but on basic questions of legitimacy, on the meaning of the country's history, and increasingly on shared facts. The question is no longer whether America is in a serious period of stress. The question is what that stress will produce, and whether the outcome can be guided by deliberate choices, or whether it will be simply determined by which force happened to prevail. The standard political response to institutional decay focuses on policy, which laws need to be changed, which officials need to be replaced, and which reforms might stabilize the system. This focus is not entirely wrong, but it addresses the surface rather than the substance. Policy is the product of deeper conditions, the kind of people a given environment elevates to power, and the incentive that the environment creates once power is obtained. To understand what a crisis will produce, it is important to examine character types rather than legislative agendas. Three types tend to rise during periods of serious institutional breakdown. The first is the cynic. This is the figure who can clearly see that the existing order is failing, but takes from that observation not a motivation to fix it, but a license to exploit it. The cynic's skill is navigation. He thrives in unstable conditions because he has no attachment to any particular outcome beyond his own position. In a functioning system, institutions constrain this type. In a decaying one, those constraints weaken, and his apparent clear-headedness can be mistaken for wisdom. What it actually represents is the conversion of the public life from service into extraction. The second type is the fanatic, whose defining feature is not anger but the need to impose a simple story on a situation that has become genuinely difficult to read. The fanatic divides the world cleanly between the virtuous and the corrupt, the saved and the condemned, and offers this clarity as a substitute for the complexity that people can no longer process. The appeal in crisis situations is obvious. When events are moving faster than they can be interpreted, the people with the clearest story command the most attention. The problem is structural. The fanatic's worldview requires an enemy serious enough to justify the level of conflict being demanded. A problem that can partially be solved does not serve the narrative. An opponent who can be negotiated with is not truly an opponent. Fanaticism, therefore, does not resolve instability, turning manageable disputes into all or nothing confrontations, and destroying the common ground on which any eventual resolutions would have been built. The third type is what might be called the restorer, the figure whose authority comes not from exploiting disorder, but from the genuine capacity to end it. The restorer rarely arrives with a elaborated version of the future. His responsibility is more immediate, a demonstrated ability to draw lines, to establish that certain things will no longer be tolerated, and to establish enough order on a chaotic situation that normal life can resume. When this type of leadership succeeds, it creates the conditions for a period of stability, the kind of era that later generations remember, often with exaggeration, as a golden age. Augustus brought order to a Roman Republic that had been destroying itself for decades. The Union governments of Lincoln and the post-war settlements under FDR, each in their different ways, pulled the American order back from ruptures that might have ended it. The central problem is that the conditions which produced the restorer also produced the tyrant, and the two are not reliably distinguishable in advance. Both emerge from a culture desperate for order and also gained authority precisely because they are willing to act where others have hesitated. The difference lies in whether they understand their authority as something held in trust for an order that existed before them and will outlast them, or something they have generated themselves, and therefore own, and not how they present themselves. The second type can be a genuine restorer. The first, whatever relief his arrival initially provides, is simply a new version of the chaos he was supposed to resolve. The American situation adds another layer of difficulty. The country is not just divided on political questions, but on the more fundamental question of what legitimate authority looks like. There is no longer a shared understanding of what the constitutional order means, what obligation it imposes, or even what history it is meant to embody. Any serious attempt to consolidate power in this environment will be read by some part of the population as an illegitimate seizure. The defensive logic of each faction produces an escalation dynamic in which restraint is treated as weakness, and those willing to push furthest consistently gain ground. This is a persistent situation, and escaping it requires a level of shared cultural ground that doesn't currently exist. Fragmentation does not come with an announcement, nor does it arrive at a single clean break that everyone can point to afterwards and say, "That is when things changed." It comes instead as a series of small adjustments that together adds up to a fundamental change in how political life works. The process is slow enough that people living through it can maintain for a long time the belief that they are seeing temporary dysfunction rather than something structural. This is a natural result of the fact that, in early and middle stages, fragmentation preserves the external forms of the system it is hollowing out. The most telling indicator of fragmentation is not in the content of laws or the results of elections. It is in the question that political actors ask themselves before they act. In a healthy political order, the governing question is whether a proposed action is legitimate. In a fragmenting order, that question is progressively replaced by a different one: whether a proposed action is achievable. meaning whether the actor has enough power to carry it out and enough cover to avoid meaningful consequences. This shift rarely announces itself. It shows up as an accumulation of episodes in which actors who had previously been held back by concerns about legitimacy act purely on the basis of what they can get away with. As this process continues, loyalty shrinks towards smaller and smaller units. National identity, at its strongest, functions as a real source of shared obligation, a sense that citizens owe something to one another simply by virtue of belonging to the same political community. As that identity weakens, people fall back on smaller circles, political parties, ideology, religion, ethnicity, and culture. Each contraction follows its own logic. As the larger identity proves less and less able to provide and protect for the people within it, smaller identities that offer more reliable solidarity becomes more rational to invest in. The result is a society organized around a collection of mutual suspicious groups, each of which interprets its own escalations as defensive responses to the escalations of others. In this environment, restraint is structurally penalized, and those willing to push hardest consistently advance. The international consequences of this internal process does not wait for it to reach its conclusion. The global order that the United States built and maintained after the Second World War depends on a level of American consistency that was itself a product of domestic coherence. As that coherence erodes, the reliability of American commitments erodes with it, through the quiet adjustments of allied and rival governments to a less predictable America. Allies who can no longer count on a consistent American backing rational to build independent capabilities. Rivals who sense American distraction are rational to test what they can achieve. The result is not a sudden collapse of international order, but a slow increase in conflict and instability as the constraints American power had imposed on regional aggression gradually loosen. At home, prolonged fragmentation produces what older civilizations call decadence, a word that has been used so loosely it has nearly lost its meaning, but which describes something precise. Decadence is not simply excess or moral looseness, though it tends to produce both. It is a specific orientation towards the future, the widespread loss of confidence that long-term investments in families, communities, civic institutions, or cultural projects will actually pay off. When the future looks genuinely uncertain, it becomes rational to discount it, to prioritize immediate gratification over deferred reward, and to treat serious engagement with lasting questions as a form of naivety. This disposition, once it becomes common, reinforces itself. A culture that stops investing in the future chooses a future less worth investing in, confirming the original judgment. The historical examples of this stage follow a consistent pattern. The late Roman Empire kept its physical infrastructure and administrative machinery running for generations after the cultural and political conditions that built them had collapsed. Late Imperial China managed the outward forms of Confucian governance even after those forms had lost their connection to the beliefs that justified them. The Soviet Union went on reciting its ideological formulas and maintaining its institutional structures through decades when almost no one in the system actually believed in either. In each case, the system continued to function past the point when its underlying principle had expired, but it grew progressively more rigid, less able to respond to new pressures and more vulnerable to the acute crisis that would eventually expose the distance between its formal continuity and its real decay. The analysis of historical cycles and structural pressures can slide into its own kind of fatalism, an account in which the forces at work are so large that individual choices and cultural decisions appear irrelevant. The historical evidence does not support this conclusion. The cases most worth studying are precisely those in which outcomes that seem overdetermined were changed by the quality of individual judgment and collective resolve. Rome's late republic produced Caesar, but it had earlier produced Scipio Africanus and Cato. men who held different views about what their obligations to the Roman order required of them and who acted accordingly. The relevant question is therefore not what structural forces make inevitable, but what the conditions of the present moment make possible and what kind of character in leaders and in citizens would be needed to move toward the better rather than the worse of the available outcomes. On the question of leadership, the historical record is fairly consistent. The decisive variable is not talent or even courage, but the leader's understanding of what power is actually for. The distinction between a leader who sees his authority as trust and one who sees it as something he has earned outright and therefore owns produces very different patterns of behavior. The first type will tend to act within limits even when those limits are inconvenient. The second has, in practice, no limits at all. The first can be a genuine restorer. The second, regardless of how his initial arrival feels, is simply a new version of the disorder he claims to be ending. Before the question of leader, however, is the question of what the population actually wants. Crises do not produce heroes on their own. They produce whoever the culture has prepared itself to accept. A culture accustomed to spectacle over substance, appearance of strength over reality, and to satisfactions of factional victory over the demands of governance will tend to elevate figures who reflect those habits. The leader is a product of the culture that raises him. Replacing the leader without changing the culture is treating the symptom while the disease continues. What the culture needs to recover is a disposition that different traditions have named in different ways but consistently describe. An orientation towards permanence, towards building things meant to last longer than the builders, and towards accepting present costs in exchange for future stability. The choice the present moment possesses is, at its most basic, a question about what kind of civilization America intends to be. Not in the rhetorical sense that this question gets involved constantly in political speech, but in the practical sense of what habits will be formed, what will be rewarded, and what will be refused. That choice will not be settled in a single election or a single crisis. It will be made gradually, through the assimilation of smaller decisions about who gets elevated, what conduct gets sanctioned, and what standards of seriousness are applied to public life. History offers no guarantees in either direction. It offers only observation, repeated across case after case, that strength without restraint destroys and restraint without strength collapses, and that civilizations which manage to hold together both, however imperfectly that may be, are the ones that left something worth inheriting. Whether America will be among them is genuinely uncertain. The conditions for decline are present, so are the conditions for renewal. The difference between those two outcomes is not primarily a question of resources or military capability. It is a question of culture and ultimately of character, a category that resists easy measurement but has not, across the historical record, proven irrelevant.